see if we're live over here. There we go. There's the chat. Okay. All right, so we should be live. Hopefully the audio is coming through good. I'm in Windows on my computer, not Mac OS, so hopefully I've got everything configured correctly. Okay, there's two things I wanted to do today, which is to talk about what actually is inside a computer, laptop, desktop, whatever. Now, laptops are basically going to be the same as desktops. It's just a matter of miniaturization. And especially with more recent laptops, you know, you're real thin. Let me mute this. You're real thin, thin Apple laptops or, you know, tablet type things. They're not really designed to be user serviceable. So you might be able to do some stuff, like open it up and change a few things around, but essentially it's all done in a factory and that or, you know, by technicians, right? It's not really designed for user serviceability. Now, a desktop PC, completely different in that sense, right? That, you know, if you go and you buy a Dell or whatever, right? You can get something that's real thin and whatnot, or you can get, you know, the big box, and the contents of the big box is what we're going to sort of talk about. So to sort of demonstrate this, there's two things I want to do. So I'm going to we're going to use a game that I've got on Steam called PC Building Simulator. It's kind of a silly game that it even exists, but hey, whatever. All right, let me turn that down. Okay, now those of you who guys are streaming, I've got the audio from the game turned way down so that hopefully it won't overshoot my voice, but if it sounds horrible or it's too loud or my voice is too soft, if you could just type in the Twitch chat so I can tweak it. All right, so this game is, like I said, it's a little silly. Essentially the career mode, if you will, is you have like a little PC repair shop and people send you their machines and then you fix them, and if you know, in their work ticket they'll drop little hints, and if you catch the hint as to what they're saying, and then you can get bonus money or whatever. So anyway, but it also has a free build mode, and that's what we're going to use today. So let that load. Now, in the before times, before Corona, we would actually do this by taking apart some old computers, but can't really do that. So, okay, so let me go over to a different desk. So, the first thing we need is a case. So, let's just pick one. Okay, so the box. So let's see, how about we do, are you guys all into this stupid RGB stuff nowadays? Yeah, all right. Let's get an RGB case. All right, so we got an RGB case. Let's plop it down over here on our workbench. And then it already has a couple fans installed, so that's what the part list is over on the right. So let's work on it, and let's remove the side panel. And on this particular case, there's 4 screws. So these, where that little orange or green marks are screws. and they're designed to be used with your thumb, right? So they're not, I mean, you can use a screwdriver, but you don't need to. Okay, so this is basically the empty guts of stuff, and right now there's nothing in here besides the, well, there's literally nothing in there besides the fans, okay? So, so what parts do we need to make a computer a computer? What do you guys know of, huh? Motherboard, okay, so that's gonna be the first thing. What else? CPU, okay. Yeah, graphics card or GPU. Some sort of cooling system for both of those. What else? Hard drive, okay, and RAM, and that is, yeah, we did not, right? It needs a power supply, yeah. Okay, so all of that stuff will do it. And so we'll just go through in order and basically put all these components in. Okay, so let's see. So I need to install, we need a power supply, okay? And now with power supplies, there are different, you have to choose a power supply that's gonna have be able to provide the appropriate amount of power for the components that you're picking. Okay, so we're gonna build a ridiculous gaming rig, which means we're gonna need a pretty beefy power supply. So, okay, great. So these 450 watt nonsense, nope, we're not doing that. So let's see what would be good. Yeah, how about, we'll just do 850 watts, that's probably sufficient. And then we'll put that there. And so it sort of goes, there's this plastic shroud that covers it, basically just to keep all the wires hidden, okay? So we've got our PSU installed, and then all these cables that are sticking out of it are the things that are gonna plug into all the other devices, components that we put in, so hard drives and the motherboard and so on. Okay, so let's see what else. Why is it not installing? It says it's installed. Okay, anyway. All right, now, motherboard. Okay, so for a motherboard, we've got a couple of choices here. And actually, let me go to the processor first, because there are two companies, for the PC world anyway, that manufacture processors, right? So there's Intel and there's AMD. And the architecture that they use is basically the same. There's a long story behind that. Right, so we have to choose basically between Intel and AMD, and there's, you know, they kind of tit for tat who's got better stuff, and then one of them will get lazy because they're dominating the market, and then a few years later they'll be in the toilet, and right now Intel's sort of in the toilet. Okay, so let's pick a AMD processor, and let's see what would be good. We'll just do I thought they had more of them in here. All right, we'll just do this one. Okay, so a can't fit Ryzen 7 8 core. Okay, because we don't have a motherboard for it yet. Okay. So, so let's pick the motherboard that would go with that. Okay, so we'd have to pick a motherboard that's going to support an AMD processor, and if you look at the specs here, the way you tell which one it's going to support, because it doesn't explicitly say it, is the socket type. Okay, so on the motherboard, there's basically a little socket, and you drop the processor into it and then secure it down with a little latch system. And each processor family, the actual interface as to how many pins are in that socket, how many electrical connections are made, depends on which model it is. Okay, so if you are in this world, then you happen to know. So LGA 1151 is an Intel socket. LGA 2066, also an Intel socket. The AMD sockets are going to be where it would say AM4 or TR4, depending on whether or not it's their desktop or the Threadripper, which is like workstation class stuff. Okay, so let's just pick, say, this one right here because that'll work. AM4 is what the processor that we picked would have used. Okay, so we'll install that. And let me actually go into the, I'm going to go into the options here, and I'm going to turn on some of the stuff to kind of accelerate things. And of course I just screwed it up. So let's go back. This is the one that we picked. Yeah. Okay. So it's a little hard to see this, but the motherboard doesn't sit exactly on the case. There are these tiny little metal standoffs that you use to basically support the motherboard, but also there's a little bit of an air gap between it and the metal backplate. There's also usually on pretty modern cases this giant cutout in the backplate, and basically the CPU on the motherboard will sit over that. And when you install the cooler for the CPU, a lot of them are pretty heavy, and you have to put something on the back to help support it. And this means that you can get to it from the other side of the case. Makes it a lot easier to work on. Depending on the type of cooling you use, that may or may not be necessary, but usually it is. Okay, so we'll plop that in there, and it's going to do the little standoff stuff for us. Okay, so then you put the motherboard in, and you've got all of these. You screw pretty tiny screws that go through the motherboard into your the standoffs on the back, and then the motherboard is secured inside the chassis. Okay, so let me kind of zoom in a little bit. So that thing right there, where it says Open CPU Shield, that's where the processor will sit. So the shield is sort of the, and I have to stay close to this, otherwise it's not going to pick up my voice. The shield is basically what holds it in place. So we'll open the shield, drop the processor in, close it, and then it locks it in place, and then we put the cooling unit on top. And you can't really see this here, but there are, there's something like 1,500 little metal pins that are right there in this grid, and on the underneath side of the processor, there's little metal gold pads that they'll touch. And when we lock it in place, they'll have a tight electrical connection, and that's what powers the whole thing. Those pins, though, are also very delicate, so you've got to be very careful to not screw this up. Okay, so we'll open up the CPU shield, and then let's go back and get our processor. Now, one thing this has got is we can say fit this PC, and now it's only going to show us the processors that would be compatible with that motherboard. Okay, so, all right, so we're going to go nuts and build a 16-core beast, right? Might as well. Okay, so then we drop that in, and then latch it back in, and now it's in place, locked in, good to go. Okay, so now it's too bad I don't have the actual machines here, the dead ones. I mentioned that on the underside of the processor are a bunch of little gold pads, and in the motherboard are a bunch of little gold pins that stick up. 20 years ago, it was actually the opposite. The pins were on the processor, and then the motherboard had basically a bunch of holes that the pin would go into. Yeah. Did I forget something?
I thought that the pins were on the actual processor.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
At least on those. I think the Threadripper is the other way.
Okay, well, so Intel chips, the pins are, they moved like maybe 15 years ago or so, the pins onto the motherboard and the processors are female. One of the reasons for that is that generally speaking, the processor is more expensive of a component than the motherboard. And if you bend the pins or break one, like you're hosed, right? So it's easier to replace a motherboard than it is a processor from an economic standpoint. I didn't actually realize that the is still pins. Okay. I haven't built an AMD system in many years.
I've never built an AMD system.
So I'm hoping to build one maybe this winter.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see. Okay, so anyway, some processors have pins on them, others have pads, and then the motherboard is sort of the opposite of whatever it is. So Intel stuff, if you went back, 30 years, everything that you would get would have pins on the chip and holes in the board. But not all of them are the same now. Okay, so what else do we need on this thing? Okay, we need graphics, right? If we're going to be doing a serious gaming rig, and if we're going to do a serious gaming rig, then, well, let's see. Well, okay, so we got a couple of options here, right? Well, lots of options, but same thing with the processor manufacturer. There are essentially two big companies that manufacture graphics hardware. AMD happens to be one of them. And NVIDIA is the other. So AMD bought a company that made GPUs many years ago. It was called ATI, and they integrated that business into AMD, and so now it's sort of a one-stop shop. All right, so Cole on chat asks, what's the advantages of AMD over Intel and vice versa? Sometimes cost. Right now, AMD has a bit of an advantage in terms of the manufacturing technology of how small the silicon pathways are, which means you can get either more computational power for equal amount of electricity or lower the electricity requirements. Typically, at least right now, most Intel processors are going to be better from a gaming perspective because games usually, so what kind of processor do we put in here? We put a 16-core chip in. So what does a core mean? When I say 16-core, what does that mean? Yeah?
Mostly like what handles for like.
Yeah. Okay, so a 16-core chip is really actually 16 separate little processors all put together. Okay, so back in the day, 20 years ago, when you bought a computer, each chip was a single core, right? It could literally do one thing at a time. And one of the developments since that time is to be able to put multiple, basically independent processors onto a single piece of silicon. So the 16 cores, or however many are in a chip, it depends on how many of them that you're actually using for how fast they run. Okay, most games, not all, but many, only actually use one core. And so if you've got a processor that runs super fast when only one core's in use, that's going to be better for tasks that only are using one core at a time, like many games. Whereas if we were building, like let's say we wanted to have a video editing workstation, okay, video editing software and a lot of other sort of professional grade software will use whatever resources you can throw at it. And so if you've got more cores, then it can split up the workload so that each one does a portion of the work and then you reassemble the results at the end, and that'll accelerate things quite a bit. Yeah, right now, yeah, and some part of it's also cost, that in general AMD is less expensive than Intel for an equivalent bang to buck. That's not 100% true, but roughly speaking it is. Okay, so let's see what else we got. So we're going to put a beefy old thing in here. And I don't know about you guys, but if we're going to build a gaming system, we're putting 2080 Ti's in here. In fact, let me just search. Yeah, so Titans, like, I mean, they're powerful, but they're really better suited for workstation kind of stuff, not gaming. Plus, let's say we don't have an unlimited budget here. Okay, but anyway, let's do 2080 Ti, and then this thing goes here. Oh, I forgot to remove the. Forgot to remove the covers. All right, so let me remove all of these. So each of these little slots, there's a metal cover and a screw that secures it. And then on the board, there are these little slots, and expansion cards will sort of line up and will screw into those metal brackets, and that's what secures them in place. So I had to remove those before I can put the motherboard, or I mean the graphics card in. Okay, so now we'll throw that in and then bolt it down. Okay, so this graphics card is, I wish I could sort of move around a little bit more. It's basically just shy of 3 slot widths thick. The reason it's so freaking thick is because what you're mostly looking at is a giant heat sink, right? So these parts use, 300 watts of power, roughly. And so they're putting out a considerable amount of heat, and you need a heat sink and a bunch of fans in order to keep that cool. Now, unless we wanted to go really crazy and liquid cool this machine, which is the real way to go. But, yeah, okay. So the graphics card goes into a little slot called a PCI Express slot, and it's the real long one, so it's an X16, and then there's a little latch mechanism so it's very difficult to get the thing back out unless you're deliberately wanting to remove it. You secure it with the metal screws there, and then right there, where those little grids are, that's where we would plug in power to it from the power supply. And this one takes 2 8-pin connectors, which is about the most power that you ever need on one of these machines. Now, if we wanted to build, like I said, a really, really serious gaming rig, let's put in 2 of them. Yeah. So you can have multiple graphics cards, and then this little bridge thing connects the 2 of them so that they can communicate directly with each other. So why would you want to have multiple graphics cards in your system? Well, if you want to play like 4K at 60 frames a second or something like that, you're going to need some beefy hardware. Or if you're trying to mine lots of Bitcoin or something stupid, don't mine Bitcoin. It's silly. Anyway, okay, so we'd have to power those things up, and we'll deal with all the power later. What other components are we missing? Okay, we need RAM, and RAM is essentially short-term memory, so whatever's actually being done at the moment is loaded into RAM. All right, so let's go to memory, and let's just kind of look through what we've got. And some of these are, kind of ridiculous things that have lighting and stupid effects like that. So here we go. I think our board supported 2666, so we'll do that. Okay, so then I've got to open the memory clip, drop the RAM in. Okay, now on this particular motherboard, there are 4 slots for memory. And the architecture uses what's called dual channel. So we want to install these things in pairs. But if we're going crazy and building a massive system, we'll just fill the board. So we'll basically just do what we just did 4 times. And depending on the way the board is set up, I've seen it both ways. You put the pairs in either like this where they're staggered, or the pairs are put next to each other. It just depends on the board. Anyway, we'll go ahead and, like I said, fill the board. One thing you can't see because of the angle we're looking at it here is the RAM chips, and it's been like this as long as I can remember. There's a little notch in them, so it's like a long rectangle. There's a little notch, and the notch is deliberately not put in the center, which means that when you put the thing into the slot, you can't put it in backwards. It can only go in one direction. Same thing, by the way, with your processors. There's usually a little notch on one corner so that you can only put it in one way. And because if you tried to put it in the wrong way, you'd break it. All right, so what were we going to do? One more stick of RAM. Okay, good. So we've got RAM, we've got our motherboard, we've got some serious graphics hardware going on here. We got the processor installed. What else do we need? Yes?
PS3 is not installed.
Yeah. Oh, did I not actually install it?
No, I don't think you screwed on the screws on the top.
Oh, okay. Well, let's remove the back side of the case. I wish there was a way I could remove the shroud so I could show you guys. I also wish there were a way I could like rotate the view, but I don't know why it won't let me do that. There's sometimes a back plate on that. All right, so power supply. All right, let's see, what did we do? I think we picked an 800 watt. There we go, okay. So there's little screws that you put through the back of the thing to secure the power supply in place. And so it's underneath there, it's just the shrouds covering it. Depending on the case, these shrouds, you can remove them, put everything in, and then put the shroud in when you're finished just to make it look tidy. But yeah, so that's good enough for now. Okay, so we got the power supply. What other components do we still need? Yeah. Yeah, we need the cooler for the CPU. The GPU's already got it built on, okay, unless we were to do some custom water cooling. But we need a cooler for the CPU. What else? Hard drive. We missing anything else? No? Okay, what about like networking or audio or anything like that?
Like a card?
Huh?
Like a networking card or an audio card?
Yeah, so where do we need to put one of these things in?
I feel like we do. I don't know if we can.
Okay, so the answer is yes and no. We could if we wanted to. However, nowadays most motherboards come with those things built on. Okay, so networking, audio, all of that stuff is on the motherboard. You don't have to have a separate card for it. So back in the day, you did. Your motherboard had basically nothing on it except for a place to connect the keyboard and the mouse. And if you wanted networking, you had to have a card for networking. If you wanted audio, you had to have a separate card for that. And so you had lots of these separate cards that to do all of the sub-functions that you would need. But like I said, nowadays most of that stuff is built onto the motherboard, and so you don't need a separate component for it, which is handy. The downside, though, is that what happens if the sound chip on the motherboard dies? Well, you're hosed, right? Okay, so all we need, right, is the hard drive, and I probably should have done this after the power supply. I'm sorry, before we did the thing. Okay, so with hard drives, there's really two types, but sort of two subtypes within one. So you can have your spinning platter, okay, which is, there's literally a series of metal discs that are spinning, and then like a little, it almost looks like the head on a record that hovers over it and writes and reads data by using a magnetic field to change the orientation of the electrons in the metal platter. They can hold a lot of data, but they're slow. Alternatively, you can have a solid state device, okay? They're more expensive per unit of storage, but they're a crap ton faster. Now, within the solid state department, there are sort of two interfaces that you can use. What's called M.2 or serial ATA. Okay, so serial ATA is a little slower, and the M.2 stuff is like ridiculously fast. So just to give you a sense of the difference, right? So a SATA serial ATA drive can transfer 540 megabytes a second, right? An M.2, you're looking at minimum 2 gigabytes a second, right? So we're talking basically a factor of 4, and that's at minimum the difference. So these the SATA, the M.2 drives are going to be way faster, and depending on which one it is, right? So I've seen ones that can do like 4.5 gigabytes a second. They're just ridiculous how fast they are. Okay, so like this thing, for example, 3,800 megs a second. It's just obscene. 4,600, right? Okay, so let's take one of these guys. And then where this would get installed is there's little slots where you put them in on the motherboard. And I probably should have removed, let's remove the graphics card, because usually the slot for these is sort of underneath the board there. So let's just pick one. And all right, I'll just pick this one there. And it'll go right there, and then it screws into place. Okay, so now I can put the graphics cards back in on top of it. So you got to do this sort of in the proper order. All right, I'll leave the graphics cards out for now. We've already talked about that. Okay, so hard drive, we also need, last but not least, cooling for the CPU, okay? Now, with cooling, you got two options. You can do air cooling, and you can do water cooling, or liquid cooling, okay? So air cooling, you have basically, so this thing that you're looking at there is a big heat sink that'll stick up, and it's got a fan or two that'll blow air through the heat sink and dissipate heat. All right, now, where are my gearhead car people in the room? Yeah? All right, so air-cooled versus liquid-cooled cars, right? So what's going to be the difference in terms of, you know, how, like an air-cooled Porsche or something, what is that like? Like, how do you cool the engine?
Like air moving through from like the front grille, or I mean.
Okay, yeah, the front grille. Now, most cars, how are they cooled?
Cooling.
Okay, there's a coolant and a big old radiator in the front grille, okay? And that the coolant is circulated around the engine block and then into the radiator. And there's usually a big fan in front of the radiator, although if you're going 70 miles an hour, right, air is sort of forced through. But the fan means that you don't have to actually be in motion to cool to have airflow through the radiator. An air-cooled car, like an air-cooled Porsche, if you were to rev the engine and leave it revved but not actually be moving, it would overheat because there's not air flowing over it when you're in motion. Okay, so similar sort of issue with the computer cooling. Dr. Dunaway is on the chat. Oh, I don't want to log in. So Dr. Dunaway is like, will this let me play Diablo 2 at 800 by 600? Getting tired of 640 by 480. These are jokes from before you guys were born. How many of you guys have played Diablo 2? Diablo 3? Original Diablo? Yeah, get off my lawn. Okay. All right, anyway. So air cooling versus liquid cooling, you get better performance out of a liquid cooler. And the principle, how these things work, is almost exactly the same as it is in an automobile. You're going to circulate coolant through a radiator, and you got some fans in front of the radiator to move air through it, okay? And therefore cool. So let's just find one of our, a good liquid cooling unit. All right, we'll use this one. Okay, so I'm going to put this, oh, I've got to remove the top of the case. Actually, you know what, I'll just put it on the front. All right, let's see, where were we? We'll put this guy right here. Okay, so it would go right there, and of course I've got to remove the parts here. Oh, I see. Probably also have to remove these fans. I should have turned on auto unscrew, but that's okay. All right, so let's go down to that. Put you here. Okay, and it for the purpose of the game has the fans pre-installed on this. Essentially, you've got little bolts that you put through the fan that go into the radiator, and then you bolt the radiator itself into the case. You can put fans on both sides of it for what we call push-pull configuration. You get slightly better performance out of that, but it's usually not really that worth it. Okay, and then this part there, so this is what's called an all-in-one system. In order for liquid cooling to work, you need liquid, you need a radiator, you need a pump to move the stuff, and you need a reservoir to hold that liquid, okay? So in your car, right, there's a coolant, like, little tank thing that you sometimes have to add liquid to, okay? And then there's a pump and the radiator, obviously, and then the fan that goes with it. These all-in-one things are designed as sealed systems. So you buy it, it's already got the liquid inside. Usually it's ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, right? So a mixture of water and antifreeze is what most of these use. It's pretty similar to car coolant, by the way. And then, so the pump is actually inside this little housing right there. It doesn't have to be huge. And you put the water block, which holds the pump, and also on the underside of it, there's a metal pad, usually copper, because copper is very good at transmitting heat. You put that on top of the processor with a little bit, and I actually skipped this, you have to put a little bit of stuff in between called thermal interface material. Most of these all-in-one systems come with that pre-applied for you, and it's just like a little sticky pad, and you just stick it on top. But if you put two pieces of metal directly on top of each other, there is actually little bits of air in between, okay? And air does not transmit heat very well. So you put a very thin layer of this sort of goo, and that allows the heat to not to directly transfer from one surface to the other. If you use too much of it, it's actually a thermal inhibitor. So it's just a really tiny amount of the stuff that you use. Okay, so the processor, when it's running, is going to put out heat. That heat is going to move from the processor into the water block. The water block is circulating liquid through it, so that heat heats up the liquid, which goes through one of the hoses to the radiator, heats the radiator. The fan is blowing air through it, so that cools or heats the air and therefore cools the radiator. And then the cool liquid goes back through the other hose, and then the whole cycle repeats. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, I've been mentioning car stuff. How do you bolt one of these things on? Well, who's had to change a tire recently? Okay, how do you change a tire in a car? Okay, you remove all the lug nuts, you put the new tire on. Okay, I'm grossly oversimplifying that part of it, but then what? You put the new tire on, and you got to tighten the lug nuts. But how do you tighten the lug nuts?
Star cross pattern.
Yeah, you do sort of a star cross pattern kind of thing. So you don't do them like that. You go crosswise. Okay, and of course on a car there's what, 5 or 6. On these there's 4, but you do the bolting down exactly the same way for exactly the same reason. Okay, why do you do the lug nuts in that pattern on a tire instead of just going around? Yeah?
So you can get it even, like the pressure all the way around.
And that's the exact idea with the computer. Okay, so yeah, just FYI. Okay, so basically, we're, with the exception of running all the power and data or power cables, we're done. Okay, we don't need a data cable for this hard drive because it plugs straight into the motherboard. Okay, and I'd have to put the video card back in. But other than running the power, this thing's done. And that's how you put together a computer, at least in this game. Okay, so questions. I'll skip the power part because that's kind of boring. Question, preguntas, fragen? No? Huh?
9.
9? All right, so let me quit here and show you how you could do this not in a game. Okay, so if you actually wanted to do this for real and not in a simulation kind of capacity, then you're going to have to buy parts from someplace. Okay, and Amazon does actually carry a lot of computing hardware, but the particular site that I have used for years to buy almost all of my hardware is a site called Newegg. Has anybody heard of that before you walked in the room today? Excellent. Okay. No, I do not want to do your survey. Okay, so one of the things that Newegg, this is a relatively recent feature that they added, is a PC configurator where you can basically, in a guided format, pick all of the parts for a desktop PC. Okay, and they've even got some sort of pre-configured or prefab type options to help you get started. Okay, so for example, let's say that we wanted to build, a beastly gaming system there. Well, let's just go with their pre-built, and I'll do, since we did AMD before, I'll do Intel this time. Okay, so build it with Intel. Okay, and then it's going to show us here a list of pre-selected components, and we could swap some of these out if we wanted, or take it as is, and it's a full-fledged computer. Okay, so everything here is all we need to build the thing. And all right, so where are we in terms of price? About $2,000. Okay, so so one of the things I'm going to have you guys do is actually make one of these. Go in and build your sort of whatever PC you want. Now, that said, some of you guys probably don't care about video games, and you can get out. No, I'm kidding. One of the things that you want to do is set, what budget and what needs do you have for your computing, right? So if you don't care about video games, what would probably be the better way to go in terms of getting a computer? Just buy a laptop, right? Go to Dell or Apple and just get something. Okay, it doesn't have to be super whiz-bang. So this sort of thing is if you're building a more beefy machine, generally speaking. Although, so like I built 2 computers for my grandparents that, maybe were about $400 each, but did it through Newegg. Just, found a little small case, small motherboard, low power processor, etc. And, so you can do everything from budget on up. Okay, and like in the game, let me hide that. Like in the game, it's only going to show us things that are going to fit the configuration that we've selected, right? So if we decide, all right, we're going to go with Intel, then it's not going to show me things that won't actually fit into the machine. This works basically just like it did in the game, except in the game we were sort of actually putting things together, or at least simulating that, and not worrying about cost. Okay, so when you guys do this, and I'll put details up on Canvas, think about a budget, and then try to configure something within that budget. Now, if you want to go nuts and just pretend that you don't have a budget, so a few years ago I had a student that did this, and he said, well, my daddy is a Fiji, so money is no object. And so he spent like well, he didn't actually spend it, but he built a $15,000 system. So if you guys want to have Fiji daddies, then go for it. And if you're a moidiocyst, then, do you guys know a moid? No? Where are the Kappa Sigs in the group? Do I have any Kappa Sigs in the group? No? All right, whatever. Never mind. Okay. Since we're in here, there's one thing I forgot to point out earlier. You see this thing that says TDP on a processor? That's basically the thermals. So 65 watts versus 125 watts, right? That's how much heat it would be pumping out at full load. 120 watts is quite a bit. Right? I mean, that's two 60-watt light bulbs, basically, right? You could easily burn yourself on that. And that's why you've got to have such beefy cooling. And one reason I kind of prefer liquid cooling. It's more reliable. Okay. So, any questions for sort of the end of this here? All right, so what we're going to do next week is we've talked about the big picture, what makes a giant computer a computer, right? And the processor, as part of it, there are, something like, depending on exactly the processor, but on the order of billions of transistors in this thing. So Monday, we're going to go back to and talk about a single transistor, right? What is a transistor? How does it work? What happens, and then what happens when we start to put two of them together? And then from there, it's sort of like, all right, if you can put two together, you can put like four together, and then it's not a big jump to go to billions, right? Okay, so we started really big, and we're going to go back to really small, and then work our way up back to big and back to small, right? So for the remainder of the semester, we'll be kind of playing that game between the single, like, circuit level stuff to the sort of macro level and everything in between. Okay. All right. Now, I did get a couple of questions about, so Canvas, I had forgotten to hit the publish button, and so that's why none of you could see anything. I hit that button. So now you should be able to see the first module, the intro stuff that's got the links to the two parts of the documentary and the podcast. Okay, and we've got the quiz over those. When's that due? Sunday night. Okay, yes.
On Canvas, it actually says it's only open for less than a minute.
Yeah, it's still
Oh, you mean the assignment?
Yeah,
Like actual quiz. It opens at 11:59, but also closes at 11:59.
Well, you better be really fast then. Okay. No, I'll fix that. That's my bad, yeah. Sorry, that was not intentional. Yeah.
I already watched the two videos. Is it how the machine that changed the world?
Yeah.
Those two videos?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a quiz, like a reading comprehension type quiz, and that's what's messed up because I made it that you had to do the whole thing in 60 seconds, which is not intended. Okay, I'll fix that when I get back to my office. All right, so we'll quit the stream and see you guys later.